of vital energy routes. Joining us now is Dr. Jeffrey Miller, a geopolitical analyst and editor of Gulf States Insights. Dunudin joining us live from New Zealand. Sir, thank you very much for taking the time in joining us. In terms of how diplomacy is going, was this expected? Rejections of both sides within the past 48 hours. Seemingly, talks have gone stale once again, even though Donald Trump continues to put statements about the prospect of a deal coming very soon. But it seems that things have overall stalled. What is your view on how negotiations are going with the backdrop of that tension over these critical trade waterways?
Oh, hello to you, and thanks for having me on the program. Look, the signs are not good at all. It seems that the two sides, Iran and the United States, are just poles apart here. They're not on the same page. They're not even reading the same book, I think, at the moment. They're talking about two different sets of demands. Iran wants to focus solely on the blockade issue, on the Strait of Hormuz issue, and stopping the war on all fronts, including the war in Lebanon, which is continuing to rage on despite a ceasefire supposedly being in place since mid-April. So it's really not good. The United States wants to focus on the nuclear aspect of this. They're very focused on the nuclear issue. They want that enriched uranium. Remember, Iran has around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to around the 60% level. They want that taken out of the country. Iran doesn't even really want to talk about that. And if it does, it is offering a deal, an arrangement far, far different to what the United States is seeking. So Donald Trump himself characterized the ceasefire as being on life support on Monday, and I think that's a pretty accurate description of the situation we find ourselves in. It seems like a very dangerous moment, and it feels like we've been drifting towards a restart of the war for some time now, and I don't think these recent developments really change the general, I guess, the general signs that point towards that.
And Dr. Miller, we saw the Strait of Hormuz opened, albeit very, very briefly. This came after the United States refused to remove its blockade of Iranian ports. The Strait of Hormuz opening has been on the agenda and pretty much very, very crucial to these negotiations as soon as the war started. However, what the Americans did refuse to do was lift that blockade. Are those nuclear talks key to the removal of that?
Well, I think in some ways they're related, but in other ways they're completely separate. I think what is clear here is that Iran has an enormous amount of leverage with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because it is really putting pressure on the global economy, and that is putting pressure in turn on Donald Trump. And I've got a piece coming out shortly for Gulf States Insights that looks at Saudi Aramco and the warning that its CEO has issued over this. He's warning that oil will be at critically low levels in the coming months, and that effectively the world has been artificially cushioned since the war began by the release of strategic reserves all around the world and just using up existing stocks. So the oil price has not gone as high perhaps as it could have done, and the fact that the oil is still flowed, albeit in reduced quantities and at higher prices, but we have still seen oil flowing around the world, and he's saying, the CEO of the world's biggest oil company, that the party is going to stop and that the war is going to have a calamitous effect on oil supplies. So Iran effectively just needs to sit this out, because all this damage is happening to the global economy. Look, Iran is in a bad state of affairs itself. Its economy is very weakened by the war and by years of sanctions. But they're used to that, frankly, and the regime is used to that. And they are willing, I think, to just sit it out. They are waiting for Donald Trump to make the first move here. And I think, unfortunately, Donald Trump is listening to the hawks in his administration and is probably going to go back to war. That's the wrong decision, in my view. I think we should be going for a diplomatic deal. But it's very hard for these mediators to really bring these two sides together when they are just so far apart. But let's wait and see. Donald Trump is heading to Beijing to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday. There is always a chance that this China trip could bring some movement in the Middle East. Remember, it's happened before. China was involved in restoring diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia back in 2023. So, China is, of course, deeply affected by this war in terms of the oil flows. So much of that oil that crosses through the Strait of Hormuz goes towards China. So China has a vested interest here in bringing down the tensions and bringing the sides to the table. So there's always a chance there that this will bring some movement into the situation. Otherwise, look, perhaps we're just waiting until this China visit is over, and then Donald Trump will restart the war. I think the signs overall are not good.
And in terms of Gulf states, around 14 of which have been struck by Iranian missiles over the past 2 months, how has that entire region changed? Has Iran now, with that point of leverage that is the Strait of Hormuz, as you've mentioned, really established itself after this conflict as a player with global leverage at this point, a newly found amount of global leverage, one that can even bring the world's largest economy and world's largest military hegemon to the table, and has that impact? Are we ever going to see the same Middle East again after this conflict?
The short answer is no. I think we've seen Iran use its leverage and play the card that's always been talked about, but it's perhaps never been played in quite the way it has this time around. That is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and it's been, I think, brutally effective. It's been brutal on the 6 Gulf states. That's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is actually in the best position of the Gulf states because of the fact that it has a Red Sea coast, because it has an east to west pipeline. It's been able to still ship significant quantities of oil. The UAE also has been able to ship some oil. But if you look at the likes of Qatar or Bahrain, Kuwait, they've been deeply, deeply affected. Qatar's natural gas exports have virtually ground to a halt because they are simply landlocked almost at this point. They are in that Gulf lake, as it were, because of this blockade. Their gas facilities, in the case of Qatar, natural gas facilities have been severely damaged by Iran. There was a massive strike there on the Ras Laffan facilities back in mid-March that have done tremendous damage, taken out 17% of Qatar's natural gas exports for up to the next 5 years, $20 billion a year hit to its annual revenues. So it's been quite extraordinary, the damage that has been done across the Gulf region, particularly to the Gulf states, which are strong US allies, and they have certainly borne the brunt of a lot of this war in terms of the fallout. And Iran has shown that it is willing to strike all of those Gulf states, cause maximum damage, and use that leverage to put pressure on Donald Trump and the United States. It's been very effective from Iran's perspective, but it's been terrible for the Gulf states and terrible for the world. So the answer, in my view, is simply to go back to the negotiating table. Ultimately, we need more diplomacy, de-escalation, dialogue. I think Iran, even in its heart of hearts, knows that it's not going to get away with these maximalist demands, that there will be some compromise at some point. I think it's in everyone's interest to get to that compromise sooner rather than later.
Dr. Miller, thank you so much. Do stay with us. We have some breaking news, first of all, coming from the UK before we move back to West Asia, where British counter-terrorism police have charged a man in connection with an arson attack on a former synagogue in East London